The hatch cover moved. It was a square of salvaged boards, fitted into the mouth of an old stone well on a dead claim in the middle of Kansas Territory. And it moved because a 15-year-old girl was pushing it open from below. The rope handle she had braided from strips of old canvas pulled taut in her hands. Cold air poured down the shaft in a rush, and Maggie Calloway squinted against it, blinking at the white violence screaming across the January sky above her. 5 faces looked down at her from the rim of the well opening. 5 faces red with cold, slicked with snow, rigid with the particular blankness that settles over a person when they have stopped expecting to survive. Behind those 5 faces, the Kansas plains had disappeared. The world above the well was a single roaring wall of white that moved sideways at 40 miles an hour, driving snow so thick and fine that it packed into the cracks around eyes and pressed flat against nostrils and made every breath a small battle. The temperature was 31 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind made it feel worse than that. Maggie looked at the 5 faces. She recognized 4 of them. The 5th was one she had hoped never to see again. She stepped back on the wooden ladder she had built from willow poles, lashed with rawhide strips, pressed herself against the curved stone wall of the shaft, and said the only thing there was to say. "Come down." They came, one at a time, down the ladder into the shaft. Through the low doorway she had cut into the stone lining 8 feet below the surface and into the horizontal chamber she had dug with a broken-handled spade through 3 weeks of September labor. The chamber was 9 feet long and 7 feet wide and 6 feet high at its tallest point. The floor was packed earth, hard as stone from months of use. The ceiling was willow poles laid close together with 2 feet of excavated soil piled on top, and from the center of that ceiling hung a stub of tallow candle that threw its light in a small, warm circle across the dirt walls. In the eastern corner, a stone brazier no bigger than a wash basin sat cold, because Maggie had been saving fuel and the earth itself had been enough. The last person down the ladder was the 5th face, Thomas Greer. He was 43 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a beard gone to frost and hands shaking so hard he could barely grip the willow rungs. He had been on the road between claims when the storm hit. He had walked 2 miles through the white wall before he found the Aldrich family stumbling toward the abandoned Mercer homestead, and he had followed them because Thomas Greer was a man who followed other people toward shelter rather than finding his own. He stepped through the low doorway into the chamber and straightened up and looked at the girl who had built it. She was already lighting the brazier with a flint striker, her hand steady, her face carrying no expression he could read. The temperature in the chamber, before the fire was even lit, was 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Ruth Caldwell, 42 years old, farmer's wife, the one person in Cutter's Creek settlement who had given Maggie anything without expecting payment, sat down on the earthen floor and pressed both hands against the wall and held them there. After a moment, she began to cry. Not from cold, from relief. The wall was cool to the touch, not frozen, not even close to frozen. It was the temperature of a root cellar in October, the temperature of bread dough set to rise, the temperature of living things. To understand why a grown woman wept at the feel of a dirt wall on the worst night in the territory's young history, you have to go back 5 months, to August of 1856, to the morning a man decided that a 15-year-old girl was no longer worth the corn she ate. Hannah Calloway died on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of August, 1856. She had come down with fever in late July, the kind that started with shivering and ended on the frontier with whatever it chose to end with. Thomas Greer sat beside her for the last 3 days, which was the most Maggie would ever grant him in the way of credit. He sat beside her, and then she died, and then he stood up and looked at his stepdaughter across the body of his wife, and the calculation in his eyes was not cruel. It was just arithmetic. Thomas Grier was not a bad man by the standards of the Kansas frontier in 1856. He was a practical man, which on the frontier sometimes looked indistinguishable from a hard one. He had a claim of 160 acres, a sod house, a breaking plow, a mule, and $11 in cash. He had a widow woman 2 counties east who had written to him twice already, a woman with a proved-up claim and a milk cow and no children and a clear preference for a man with agricultural experience. He had, until 3 days ago, a wife. He had still a stepdaughter who was not his blood and had never been. The frontier did not have room for sentiment about these things. Everyone in Cutter's Creek understood this, and so when Thomas Grier went to town 2 weeks after Hannah's burial and told Jacob Forsyth at the general store that his wife's girl had gone to stay with relations back east, Jacob Forsyth nodded and said that was probably for the best, and meant it. What had actually happened was this. Thomas Grier had given Maggie her mother's wool coat, the one with the bone buttons. He had given her a knife, her own knife, that she had carried since she was 10. He had given her a half sack of cornmeal, perhaps 8 pounds of it, tied at the top with a twist of rope. He had told her there was a settlement 6 miles east called Cutter's Creek, and that if she kept the sun at her back in the morning and walked, she would reach it by afternoon. She had not argued. She had learned early that argument cost energy she could not afford, and she had stood in the doorway of the sod house she had helped build and looked at the man who had been her stepfather for 4 years and understood that the conversation was finished. Her mother's coat was heavy wool, dark blue, with pockets deep enough to hold the knife and most of the cornmeal if she split it between them. She put on the coat. She picked up the tied sack. She walked east. She did not cry until she was far enough from the house that he could not hear her, and then she cried for perhaps 10 minutes while she walked. And then she stopped because the prairie was long and flat, and she could see a long way in every direction, and there was nothing in any direction that cared about her grief. The settlement at Cutter's Creek was 6 miles, but the prairie made distances deceptive. What looked close was far, and what looked far was farther than that. She walked through the afternoon and through the cooling evening, and by nightfall she had reached the settlement's edge, which was a handful of frame buildings and sod structures arranged without plan around a strip of beaten earth they called the main road. She did not go into the settlement that night. She sat on the eastern edge of it, under an overhang of a storage shed, and ate a handful of cornmeal dry from her palm, and listened to the settlement settle into its nighttime sounds, and thought about what came next. What came next, she decided in the grey light before dawn, was that she needed shelter. Winter was 10 weeks away, maybe 12 if the season ran mild, but it would not run mild. Everyone who had spent a winter in Kansas territory knew what was coming. The question was not whether she would have shelter. The question was what kind and how fast she could build it. But before shelter, she needed to know the land. She spent 2 days walking the claims around Cutter's Creek, studying what was there and what was empty and what had been left behind. The settlement had grown in the 2 years since Kansas territory opened to settlement, but it had also contracted. Claims that men had filed with confidence in 1854 sat empty in 1856, their builders driven back east by grasshoppers in the summer, by river flooding in the spring, by the particular loneliness of the prairie in autumn that could hollow a person out until there was nothing left to hold them to the land. She found the Mercer claim on the second afternoon. The Mercers had filed in the spring of 1854 and built a frame house of green lumber that had already begun to warp and split in the Kansas heat. They had planted wheat that the grasshoppers took in the summer of 1856, and then they had loaded their wagon and driven east and not come back. The frame house still stood barely, its roof half collapsed from a spring hailstorm, its boards pulled free in places by the same wind that blew everything loose on the plains eventually. A collapsed outbuilding sat to the south, A corner of stone foundation suggested a smokehouse they had started and never finished. A chicken wire fence surrounded nothing, and at the center of the yard, dug deep and lined with flat sandstone, was a well. The Mercers had dug their well wide from the start, wider than most. Whether they had planned to turn it into a well house, a cool storage space, a root cellar, or simply whether the man who dug it had erred in his measurements, the shaft was 6 feet across, stone-lined, with handholds notched into the stone at intervals on one side. She could see the bottom 22 feet below, hard earth, bone dry. The water table in this section of Kansas territory ran deep, and the Mercers had apparently given up finding it. Maggie sat on the stone rim and looked down into the well for a long time. She had never read a book about building. She had never heard a lecture about thermodynamics or soil temperature or the difference between conductive heat loss and convective heat loss. What she had was the memory of her father, her real father who died when she was 7, talking about the root cellar he had dug behind the house in Missouri. He had told her that a root cellar was cool in summer and warm in winter, and that the reason was simple. The ground below the frost line, he said, was the same temperature all year, and that temperature was somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees. And that was the Earth's own heat, the warmth it had carried inside itself since before there were people to notice it. Below the frost line in Kansas territory, the ground sat at roughly 52 degrees, winter and summer alike. The frost line in this part of the territory ran about 3.5 feet deep. The Mercer well went down 22 feet. Maggie lowered herself onto the first handhold and climbed down. At the bottom of the well, in the stone-lined dark, she stood still and felt the air against her skin. After the August heat on the surface, the cool was startling at first, almost cold, the way a cellar door opening in summer felt cold for the first moment before you understood it was just cool, just the temperature of things that the sun had not been able to reach. The stone walls were damp in places, faintly, the residue of rainfall that filtered down through 22 feet of earth. The floor was firm under her boots. She stayed down there until the sky above the well opening changed from blue to orange. She stayed and felt the temperature and thought about her father's root cellar and thought about the winter coming across the prairie from the north like something inevitable and enormous. And then she climbed back out into the August heat and sat on the rim and looked west at the sun going down. She slept in the well that night. She climbed down with her wool coat and her cornmeal sack and her knife, and she folded the coat around her and lay on the hard stone floor and slept, and she woke in the morning without having shivered once. The decision to stay was not really a decision. It was more like an acknowledgement of what was already true. She had nowhere to go. She had no money, no relations, no husband, no father, no mother. She had a broken claim in the middle of the Kansas prairie and a dry well that stayed 50 degrees when the surface world was either baking or freezing. She had a broken-handled spade she had found in the collapsed Mercer outbuilding, its blade still solid, its handle cracked through 2/3 of its length. She had 8 pounds of cornmeal and a knife and her mother's wool coat, and 3 weeks before September ended. She went to work. The first task was the horizontal chamber. She understood, even without the vocabulary for it, that the well shaft alone would not do. Too narrow, too cylindrical, too vertical to hold heat well once winter winds began pulling cold air down from above. She needed a room, a real room, one that could hold a fire's warmth for hours after the fire died. She needed it below the frost line, below the place where winter's cold could reach down through the earth and steal the warmth from the walls. She chose a point 8 feet below the surface, where the stone lining ended and the raw earth began, and she began to dig east. It was the hardest work she had done in her life. The earth was clay-heavy, dense, threaded through with root systems from the prairie grass that had been growing in it for 1,000 years. The spade bit into it and came back with pieces the size of her fist, and she loaded these pieces into the broken canvas sack she had salvaged from the outbuilding and hauled them up the well shaft and piled them on the surface. Every load was heavy. Every trip up the handhold notches, arms burning, the loaded sack banging against her knees. She thought about the root cellar her father had described. Cool in summer, warm in winter. The earth's own heat. She dug for 3 weeks. The chamber she carved out of the Kansas earth was 9 feet long from the well shaft to its far wall, 7 feet wide, and 6 feet tall at the center. She shored the ceiling as she went, cutting willow poles from the creek bottom 3/4 of a mile east and dragging them back 2 at a time. She laid them crosswise above the chamber, close together, their bark still on, green wood that would dry and harden in place. Over the poles, she piled the excavated earth, tamping it down in layers until she had 2 feet of compressed soil above the pole ceiling, enough to insulate, enough to carry its own weight, enough to hold the ground temperature steady. She built the floor last. She packed the excavated clay floor with a wooden mallet, striking it in overlapping patterns until the surface was as hard as packed road. She lined it with dried prairie grass, 2 inches deep, and pressed it flat under her boots. It was not clean. It was not comfortable by any standard a person from a settled place would recognize. It was a room in the earth, dark and close, and smelling of clay and root and the particular mineral smell of deep soil. And it was 52 degrees in September, which meant it would be 52 degrees in January. She built the brazier next because she understood that 52 degrees would keep her alive, but it would not keep her well. She needed fire, but she needed fire that could be maintained on the fuel the prairie provided, which was buffalo chips collected from the grass, dried willow branches, and twisted bundles of dried grass stems. The brazier she constructed from flat sandstone pieces, mortared with the clay she had so much of. A simple fire chamber 18 inches across and 8 inches deep, raised on a stone base to keep it off the floor. She built a flue pipe from clay, lining a narrow shaft she dug up through the ceiling at an angle, emerging on the surface between 2 low mounds of excavated earth, where it would draw air without pulling the winter wind straight down. The pipe was 6 inches square, enough to exhaust smoke, narrow enough not to bleed heat into the cold above. She tested it one evening in early October, crouched in the chamber with a small fire of buffalo chips burning in the brazier, watching the smoke move toward the flue and up and away, feeling the warmth build in the 9-by-7-foot room. In 90 minutes, the chamber temperature had climbed from 52 degrees to 64. In 2 hours it held at 67. When she let the fire die and measured the next morning, the chamber had cooled back to 53, the same temperature the earth gave it for free. She built a ladder from willow poles and rawhide lashing, set into the well shaft to replace the hand-notch climbing she had been doing. She built a hatch cover from boards salvaged off the collapsed Mercer outbuilding, fitting them together with nails she pulled from the rotting wood itself, straightening them against a stone until they held. The hatch cover was 12 inches thick, rough, with gaps between the boards that she chinked with twisted grass pressed into wet clay. When it was fitted into the well opening, it cut the cold air column that had been pouring down the shaft at night. She attached a rope handle to the underside so she could pull it shut from the ladder. She also built a simple wooden shelf along the east wall of the chamber and a sleeping platform of willow poles and grass from the south wall, raised 8 inches off the floor to keep her out of the coldest air layer. She hung her mother's coat on a wooden peg she drove between 2 ceiling poles, where it could dry out when she came in wet and cold from surface work. She was not comfortable. She was never comfortable that autumn. She was cold when she was on the surface and only warm when she was below. And she was often hungry, working on cornmeal porridge thinned with creek water and whatever small game her snares brought in. The snares were 3 loops of twisted wire she had formed from a length of baling wire in the collapsed outbuilding, set along the creek where rabbits moved in the evenings. They caught something every 3rd or 4th day. She roasted the meat over the brazier fire and ate every part of it she could, because she had learned from her mother that hunger on the frontier was not a single night's problem. It was a mathematics problem, and the mathematics required managing every calorie with precision. She went to Cutter's Creek for the first time in late October. She had one specific need that she could not solve from the abandoned Mercer claim. The tallow candle stubs she had found in the frame house debris gave her perhaps 40 hours of total light, and she needed light in the underground chamber when the surface world was dark, which in November would be 16 hours a day. She needed tallow, or oil, or candles she could not make herself without fat she had not been able to source from the prairie yet. She walked the 6 miles on a clear morning with the wind at her back and arrived at the Cutter's Creek General Store just before midday. Jacob Forsyth ran the store. He was 50 years old, born in Ohio, with the particular bearing of a man who had decided at some point that information was more valuable than goods and had organized his life accordingly. He knew everything about everyone in a 30-mile radius of Cutter's Creek, and what he did not know, he estimated, and he was usually close enough to accurate that it made no difference. He looked at Maggie Calloway for a long moment when she came through his door. She was 15 years old, 5 feet 4, with her mother's dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth and her mother's wool coat buttoned to the chin. Her boots were worn through at one heel. Her hands were calloused in a way that hands on a 15-year-old girl had no business being, chapped at the knuckles, with clay ground into the creases in a way that washing could not entirely fix. She looked like someone who had been working very hard at something that required digging. "You're the Greer girl," he said, "Thomas Greer's wife's daughter." "I'm Margaret Calloway," she said. He absorbed this correction without acknowledgement. "I heard you went east to relations. I stayed." His eyes moved across her, cataloguing. "On the Mercer claim." "Yes, the Mercer claim's abandoned. No one's filed on it, I know." He said nothing for a moment. "Where are you wintering?" she told him. "Not everything. Not the details of the chamber's dimensions, or the brazier design, or the willow pole ceiling. She said she had fixed up the well house into a shelter. She said she needed tallow for candles." Jacob Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. He was not a cruel man either, she would decide later. He was a man who had been on the frontier long enough to know that certain kinds of trouble arrived looking like certain kinds of people, and a 15-year-old girl alone on an abandoned claim in October looked like a particular kind of trouble that he did not want to be responsible for. "I don't extend credit to minors," he said. "That's not personal. I don't extend credit to minors. Do you have money?" "No." "Do you have goods to trade?" She thought about the rabbit she had snared that morning, already skinned and wrapped in grass in her coat pocket. It would have been her dinner. She put it on the counter without speaking. Jacob Forsyth looked at the rabbit. He looked at her. He picked up the rabbit and set it behind the counter and counted out 4 tallow candle stubs, each about 3 inches long. "That's all you get for a rabbit," he said. She knew it wasn't fair. She took the candles anyway. She was almost to the door when the voice behind her said, "Wait, please." Ruth Caldwell was 42, brown-haired and sun-weathered, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was something better now. She had been at the counter when Maggie came in. She had heard the exchange. She was reaching into the basket she carried and pulling out a small jar, not large, perhaps half a pound of rendered lard, and holding it out. "For nothing," she said. "Just take it." Maggie stood in the doorway and looked at the jar. She had learned in the past 2 months to be careful about gifts, because gifts on the frontier usually had a shape to them, a weight that came due later. She looked at Ruth Caldwell's face and saw nothing there that worried her. She took the jar. Outside, walking back toward the Mercer claim, she added the lard to the accounting she kept in her head. 4 candle stubs, half a pound of lard that would also burn, food for 3, maybe 4 days. She was 3 miles from the claim before she noticed that Thomas Greer had been standing outside the hardware when she came out of the general store. He had watched her walk away. He had said nothing. She walked the 6 miles back, with the wind now in her face, and was underground and warm before the temperature dropped that evening. October became November. The surface world turned hostile. The temperature dropped into the 20s at night, the 30s by day, and the prairie grass went brown and stiff. Underground in the chamber it was 52 degrees without fire. She lit the brazier evenings only, burning 1 double handful of buffalo chips and 2 bundles of twisted grass, and she slept in a chamber holding 65 degrees and woke with it still above 50, warm enough to work, warm enough that her hands stayed flexible. Her neighbors in the nearest frame house were burning 1.5 cords of wood a month to maintain temperatures that still dropped below 50 on cold nights. She said nothing about her own fuel consumption. It was not her place to say. People did not always want to be told that the thing they had built with their labor and money and pride was less efficient than a hole in the ground. December brought real cold. On the coldest nights, the surface reached -10. The chamber held between 48 and 54 without fire, 68 after 90 minutes of brazier heat. She had extended her snare lines along the creek and recovered perhaps 20 pounds of viable corn kernels from the rotting Mercer grain sacks, dried and ground against a flat stone. She was not prospering. She was surviving, with more margin than anyone outside those earthen walls would have believed. She made one more trip to Cutter's Creek in December. Ruth Caldwell found her outside the general store and asked the question directly. "Is it warm down there? Truly warm?" "Warm enough," Maggie said. "How?" "The earth," she said. "The earth holds warmth the way a stone does. You go deep enough below where the frost reaches, and the ground is the same temperature all year. The walls hold it and give it back." Ruth was quiet. "That's the principle of a root cellar," she said finally. "Yes, except I sleep in it." On the walk home 6 miles through the frozen dark, Maggie felt something that was not pride and not grief, but was a kind of steady certainty. She was going to file on the Mercer claim when she was old enough to file. She was going to build something permanent above the well. She was going to stay. She believed this right up until January. What Maggie had built in those 3 months beneath the Kansas prairie was not something she could have explained to the people in Cutter's Creek in terms they would have fully credited. She did not know the words for thermal mass, or frost line, or earth-sheltered construction, or the specific physics of how a mass of Earth at 52 degrees will resist temperature change almost indefinitely, because the thermal energy required to move a large mass of soil, even 1 degree, is enormous. She only knew what her father had told her about root cellars and what she had tested herself through an autumn of careful observation. The earth held warmth the way a stone held the sun, giving it back slowly in the dark hours when the cold pressed hardest from above. If you want to understand how a 15-year-old girl survived the storm that killed 24 settlers across Kansas territory, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. We have people listening from places that know cold as well as Kansas territory did, and sometimes better. The storm that would change everything was still 3 weeks away on the morning Maggie walked back from Christmas dinner at the Caldwell place. But it was already forming, 400 miles north, moving south with the patience of something that had all the time it needed. January opened mild, surprisingly, deceptively mild. On January 4th, the temperature on the Kansas plains rose to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to soften the snow crust on the north-facing slopes and bring the prairie dogs out of their winter quiet to sit at their mound openings and look at the pale sun with the cautious optimism of creatures that have been fooled by January before. Edwin Caldwell drove to Cutter's Creek without his heavy coat for the first time in 6 weeks. Jacob Forsyth propped his store door open for an hour in the afternoon to let the air move through. On January 11th, the temperature reached 41 degrees. Children were sent to school without scarves. A traveling merchant named Silas Doran arrived from the east in his canvas-covered wagon, his goods packed under oilcloth, grateful for the mild spell that had made the roads passable. He ate dinner at the settlement and decided to stay another night before pushing west. Old Harlan Webb, who had been farming in Kansas Territory since before there was a territory to farm in, stood outside the general store that afternoon and looked north for a long time. He had come from Vermont. He had spent winters in New Hampshire. He had seen what a warm spell in January meant in cold country, had seen what happened to the people who trusted it. "You mark this," he said to Jacob Forsyth. "You mark this warmth, and you don't trust it. Weather that moves this fast, going one way, can move just as fast the other." Jacob Forsyth said that was probably true and went back inside. Maggie spent January 11th gathering fuel. She could not have explained why, exactly. The mild air should have made her relax, should have given her a day of ease after 3 months of careful rationing. Instead, she felt something wrong in the warmth, a quality to it that her body registered before her mind found words for it. She gathered buffalo chips from the frozen grass, filling her canvas sack 3 times and hauling it down through the hatch. She gathered willow branches from the creek. She twisted grass into fuel bundles until her hands cramped. By evening she had added perhaps 2.5 days of fuel to her supply. It seemed excessive. The night of the 11th was 40 degrees on the surface. She went to sleep with the hatch closed tight above her and the chamber holding its steady 52 degrees. The morning of January 12th began with sunlight. She climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open and felt warmth on her face, the same mild air, slightly softer even than the day before, and looked at the sky, which was blue and clear to the south and east and west. To the north there was a wall. It was grey-white, and it extended across the entire northern horizon from west to east without a break, and it was moving. Not slowly moving, the way clouds moved, but visibly, actually moving. The way a tide moves, the way fire moves through dry grass. It was still perhaps 40 miles away. The temperature was 38 degrees where Maggie stood on the surface. She climbed back down the ladder. She pulled the hatch shut. She pressed it tight and set the wooden bar she had built across the rope handle to keep it from being pulled open by wind from above. She stoked the brazier to a steady burn, not high, just steady, and sat on her sleeping platform and listened. The wind reached the Mercer claim at 11 in the morning. She heard it as a change in the sound of the prairie above her, a shift from the ordinary wind voice she had been hearing for 4 months to something harder and higher, a sound that was less like wind and more like pressure, like the earth above her was being pushed down by something enormous and continuous. The temperature on the surface, which had been 38 degrees at 9 in the morning, was 12 degrees by noon. It would reach -22 by midnight. She sat in her chamber and listened to the storm build. The cold came down the well shaft, despite the closed hatch, seeping through the gaps in the boards, dropping the air temperature in the shaft itself. The chamber registered the change more slowly. She tracked it by feel against her hands, pressing her palms to the earthen walls and comparing what they told her to the feel of the brazier-warmed air. At noon, the chamber was 50 degrees. At 2 in the afternoon, 49. The earth was holding. She was feeding the brazier a second bundle of twisted grass when she heard the sound. It came from above the hatch. Not the wind, which by now was making a sound she had no comparison for, a continuous roar with occasional screams in it when a gust peaked above 50 miles an hour. This sound was different. It was rhythmic. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. Someone was knocking on her hatch cover. She climbed the ladder with her lantern and pressed her face to the gap in the boards. She could see nothing but white. The snow was coming horizontally, driven so hard it was less like precipitation and more like the sky itself turning solid. She could feel the cold through the gaps, a cold so severe it was almost something other than temperature. Something that worked against skin the way acid worked against metal, immediate and corrosive. She undid the wooden bar and took hold of the rope handle and pushed. The hatch came open against the wind with effort, and the 5 faces were there. The Aldrich family had been a quarter-mile east when the storm hit. James Aldrich, 31 years old, had been in his barn checking his livestock when the wall of cold air arrived. He had run for the house, grabbed his wife Clara and their 3 children, the youngest an 8-month-old girl named Bess, who had been sleeping when the wind hit the north wall, hard enough to bow the boards inward, and he had run. His house roof was already showing the structural failure that would be complete by morning. The green lumber rafters too spaced too widely, the sod too heavy with the fast-packing snow. They had run toward the Mercer claim because it was the nearest landfall in their direction. They had run through a quarter-mile of -22-degree air at 50 miles per hour, and they were alive when they reached the well opening by the grace that sometimes attends people who have no choice but to keep moving. Behind them, by perhaps 50 yards, barely visible in the white, were Edwin and Ruth Caldwell. Their chimney had backed up when the wind changed, filling their frame house with smoke in 15 minutes, driving them out. They had seen the Aldriches running and followed, and behind the Caldwells, alone, moving in the stumbling, careful way of a man who had been outside too long and was running on the last of his warmth, was Thomas Greer. He had been on the road between the settlement and a neighbor's claim when the storm hit. He had tried to find shelter and found none, and had been following the Caldwells without knowing it for 20 minutes before he saw the group converge on the well opening. "Come down," Maggie said. They came. James Aldrich came first, handing baby Bess down through the shaft carefully, his hands so stiff with cold that he could barely grip the ladder rungs. Clara after him, pulling the 2 older children down by their arms. The Aldwells next. Ruth crying from the moment she felt the air in the shaft change from killing cold to merely cold. Edwin last, pulling the hatch shut over his head, plunging them all into the lantern-lit dark of the well chamber. And then Thomas Greer's boots appeared on the top rung of the ladder. He descended slowly, his hands white at the knuckles, his beard solid with ice. He stepped through the low doorway and stood in the chamber and straightened up, and his eyes found Maggie. The way eyes find the thing they have been avoiding, she was feeding the brazier. Steady handfuls of fuel, building the fire higher than she usually kept it, because there were now 9 people in a 9-by-7 chamber, and they were pulling the warmth out of it with every degree they had lost to the storm. The temperature in the chamber at the moment the Aldriches arrived was 48 degrees, cold enough that your breath showed, cold enough that wet clothing was dangerous, cold enough to keep food from spoiling, but not cold enough to kill, not close to cold enough to kill. Ruth Caldwell pressed her hands against the wall and wept. Clara Aldrich held baby Bess against her chest and felt the child shaking begin to slow as the chamber air worked its way into her small body. The baby had been blue at the lips when they came down the ladder. She was not blue now. She was crying, which was the best possible sound she could make. The older Aldrich children, 6 and 8 years old, sat on Maggie's sleeping platform with the numb compliance of people who have surrendered everything to the situation and are waiting to find out if they will survive it. They looked at the earthen walls and the willow pole ceiling and the stone brazier and the girl tending it and said nothing. Edwin Caldwell sat on the floor with his back against the south wall and watched the brazier for a long time. He was an engineer's son, had some training in it, had abandoned that life for farming, and the lines of the chamber were not lost on him. The way the wall met the ceiling at an angle, instead of a right angle, shedding any cold air that pooled at the top back toward the center, the way the ventilation shaft was positioned to create a slight negative pressure that pulled the brazier smoke upward without pulling cold surface air in any meaningful quantity downward. The sleeping platform raised off the floor. He looked at all of this for a long time without speaking. Thomas Greer sat against the east wall on the bare earth floor, his knees pulled up, watching Maggie. For the first hour, no one spoke much. They were all engaged in the primary project of thawing out. Maggie distributed what food she had between the children first. Cornmeal porridge made on the brazier, thick and plain, sweetened with nothing. A portion of dried meat from her last snare. Small, inadequate rations, but the children took them without complaint, and she watched the color return to their faces, the ordinary color of children who were going to live. She tended the brazier with the economy she had developed over 4 months of careful fuel management. Not too high, not too low. The temperature in the chamber climbed. 50 degrees, 53, 58. The wet clothing on the adults began to steam. James Aldrich took off his coat and held it toward the brazier heat and looked at his wife, and the look that passed between them said everything about how close it had been on that quarter-mile run. By mid-afternoon, the chamber temperature had stabilized at 62 degrees. The brazier burned a double handful of buffalo chips per hour. Maggie had fuel for 36 hours at this rate. Outside, above the hatch cover, the storm was doing whatever it was doing, and the chamber was 62 degrees. Ruth Caldwell finally stopped pressing her hands against the wall. She looked at Maggie. She said, "How long did this take you to build?" 3 weeks for the chamber, Maggie said. Before that, maybe 2 weeks for the other parts. Hatch, ladder, ventilation pipe, brazier. You dug it yourself. Yes. Ow. She explained about the broken-handled spade, the clay earth, the willow pole ceiling, the excavated soil piled on top for insulation. She explained about the frost line and what her father had told her about root cellars, about the ground temperature below the frost line being constant. She explained about the ventilation and how it was angled to draw smoke without drawing cold. She showed Ruth the slope of the chamber ceiling and explained why the angle mattered. Edwin Caldwell listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The angle of the ceiling pushes pooled cold air back down toward the floor instead of letting it accumulate near the sleeping platform." Yes. He was quiet for a moment. "And the earth walls conduct heat from the 52-degree mass surrounding this chamber into the chamber air. They give it up slowly," Maggie said. "They don't give it up fast. That's what makes it work. The earth is enormous, and it's at 52 degrees, and this little room can't pull all that warmth out of it. So the walls stay at 52, and they keep giving." Edwin Caldwell looked at the walls for a long time. He had built a frame house, he said finally, as if reporting on someone else's mistakes. 2x6 framing, board and batten siding on the outside, plaster on the inside. He had thought it was well built. He had thought the 12-inch walls were substantial. Now he was sitting in a 9-by-7-foot room, carved out of the earth by a 15-year-old girl with a broken spade, and his frame house was 2 miles away, filling with smoke in a storm that would kill people who were not underground. And he was having thoughts about what substantial actually meant. The night was long. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. Maggie could not measure the surface temperature from underground, but she could track the chamber temperature and infer from its slight downward drift how extreme the outside conditions had become. The chamber, surrounded on all sides by the enormous thermal mass of the Kansas earth, fell from 62 degrees to 58 over 8 hours. It was the slowest, most grudging surrender of heat she had observed in 4 months. Even when she let the brazier die to coals, the chamber temperature never fell below 54 that night. The Aldrich baby slept pressed between her parents, warm. The older Aldrich children slept on Maggie's sleeping platform with their coats over them, breathing the slow, deep breath of children who had survived the unsurvivable and needed sleep more than food. Ruth and Edwin Caldwell dozed against the wall, upright, hands folded, the way people slept when they were too tired not to sleep, but too aware of their surroundings to lie down. James Aldrich kept watch because that was what a man did when his family had come close to dying, and he needed to be the person who was awake in case it tried again. He watched the brazier. He watched his wife and children. He watched the earthen walls that were holding 54 degrees against God knew what temperature outside. Thomas Greer did not sleep. He sat against the east wall through the long night and watched the girl who was not his blood daughter tend the fire that was keeping 9 people alive in a chamber she had built with a broken spade and 3 weeks of labor and knowledge she had gotten from a dead man's memory. He watched her check the ventilation pipe with her hand, feeling for backdraft. He watched her gauge the fuel supply with the practiced eye of someone who had been rationing against a specific horizon for 4 months. He watched her give the last of her dried meat to the youngest Aldrich child, who was awake and fretful in the small hours, without being asked and without comment. Around 3 in the morning, when the chamber was quiet and only he and Maggie were awake, he said, "You built this." She was adding a half-handful of fuel to the brazier. She did not look up. "Yes," she said. "Before winter." "Yes." "How did you know it would work?" She thought about this for a moment. "My father told me about root cellars when I was small," she said. "He said the earth below the frost line was the same temperature all year. I thought that if the earth would do that for potatoes, it would do it for a person." He was quiet. "I've been watching you burn fuel all December," she said. "You and the others. I could see the wood piles from the road." She did not say, "I thought about telling you and decided not to." She did not say, "I thought you would not listen." She did not say any of the things she was entitled to say. He said, "I was wrong to send you out alone." She put the fuel in the brazier. The fire caught, the warmth held. "I know," she said. He did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer it. These were not the kinds of things the frontier had vocabulary for, not in a night with a storm screaming above, and 9 people alive because of what a girl had built in the ground. What there was the warmth and the brazier and the earth that held its 52 degrees against everything the Kansas winter could bring. She said, "Go to sleep. You're warm enough now." He leaned his head against the earth wall, and after a time, he slept. The storm broke at dawn, not all at once, the way some storms broke, with a sudden cessation and a blue sky. It broke slowly, the wind dying down in stages, the horizontal snow tilting gradually toward vertical, the roar becoming a hiss and then becoming silence. By 8 in the morning there was no wind at all, only cold that was no longer moving. The cold that sits still after a blizzard is a different thing from the cold that drives. It has a clarity to it, a brittle stillness that lets you understand exactly how cold it is, because there is nothing between you and the temperature. Maggie went up the ladder first. She pushed the hatch cover up against a wall of drifted snow that had packed against it during the night and shoved until it gave, climbing out into a world that had been erased and redrawn in white. The sky was the hard, clear blue that follows violence in Kansas, cloudless and impossibly open. The sun was up but gave no warmth that the skin could detect. The thermometer she had borrowed from Edwin Caldwell in December left overnight outside on a string, read -28. She stood on the surface and looked at the transformed landscape for a moment, and then she looked at what remained of the Mercer Claims surface structures. The collapsed frame house was now a white mound, unrecognizable as a building. The outbuilding was invisible, buried. Even the stone chimney she had never used was so rimed with ice and packed snow that it looked like a natural formation. The hatch cover opening in the ground, with its thin wisp of smoke still rising from the ventilation pipe, was the only sign of human habitation. She helped the others up one at a time. Baby Bess came last, passed up through the shaft in Clara Aldrich's arms, blinking in the brilliant cold light with the mild confusion of an infant who did not know she had almost died and would spend her whole life not knowing it. They stood in the snow and looked at each other in the silence that follows a storm, when people who have survived it are still taking account of themselves, still confirming that all their parts are present and working. What they found when they returned to their own homes told the rest of the story without anyone having to say it. The Aldrich house roof had not just sagged. It had collapsed fully inward, the green lumber rafters snapping under the combined weight of driven snow and the ice that had formed when the heat inside finally gave out sometime in the night. The iron stove lay on its side in the ruins, surrounded by 2 cords of firewood that had been worth something 12 hours ago and were now buried and ice-locked and useless. Everything the Aldriches owned that had been inside that house was under 3 feet of snow and splintered lumber. The Caldwell frame house was standing, but the interior told the story of the night. The backed-up chimney had deposited a layer of soot on every surface. Ice had formed on the inside of the north wall, 3/8 of an inch thick, in the places where the insulation had failed, which was most of the north wall. The water barrel 6 feet from the stove had frozen solid. Edwin Caldwell stood in his front room and looked at the ice on his interior wall and thought about what he had said to Maggie in the underground chamber about 2x6 framing and 12-inch walls being substantial. 2 families in Cutter's Creek had not left their houses when the storm hit. A man named Percy Dodd, who lived alone in a single-room frame structure on the eastern edge of the settlement, had been found by his neighbor the morning after the storm sitting upright in his chair, frozen, his fire long out. He had been healthy the morning of the 12th. He had been in his chair when the cold came through his walls faster than his store of wood could counter it. He had been alone, with no way to know that a quarter-mile away 9 people were warm in the earth. Silas Doran, the traveling merchant who had been grateful for the mild weather 2 days before, had tried to make for the next settlement when the storm hit, rather than sheltering in Cutter's Creek. His wagon and horses were found by a search party 3 days later, half a mile off the road, the horses dead. Doran, still in the wagon box under his canvas, frozen in the blankets he had wrapped around himself. He had been 6 miles from Cutter's Creek. He had had no way to know about the well. 23 people died in the storm across the territory, according to the count that assembled itself over the following 2 weeks through letters and newspaper reports and the grim accounting of county agents making their rounds. Frame houses had failed comprehensively, their thin walls offering resistance to the killing cold that was measured in hours rather than the days the storm demanded. A family in the next county east had burned through their entire winter wood supply by midnight, and then burned their furniture and then their floorboards, and still the cold came through the boards and took what it came for. The stories had a shape. The shape was this. Walls that were thin failed. Heat that was stored in air disappeared when the fire went out. Fuel that was abundant in November was gone by January. People who had built fast and cheap and assumed they would survive on will and firewood had been wrong, and the ones who paid for it paid the full price. And there was the other shape. The sod houses had held, most of them. The dugouts had held. The 2 families in Cutter's Creek who lived in earth and sod structures had gone through the storm uncomfortable but alive, their fuel supplies strained but not exhausted. One old farmer whose dugout had been his home for 4 years told anyone who would listen that he had not even lost sleep. Ruth Caldwell told the story of the well home to everyone she spoke to in the 2 weeks following the storm. She described the temperature when they arrived, the way the walls felt cool but not cold, the brazier that required a double handful of fuel per hour to heat 9 people. She described Maggie's explanation of the frost line and the Earth's constant temperature and the heat that came back slowly through the long night. Jacob Forsyth listened to all of this without comment for a week. Then he offered Maggie work managing his stock inventory, 3 mornings a week, paid in store credit. It was not generous. It was more than he had offered her in October, when he had given her 4 candle stubs for a rabbit. She accepted. She was practical. The well home had always been a beginning, not an end. The earth chamber was proof against the worst Kansas Territory could produce. What she wanted to build above it was a sod house with an earth floor below grade, connected to the underground chamber, with walls thick enough to hold heat and a roof that would not collapse under snow. She sketched it in the dirt the way she had sketched the original chamber in August. Edwin Caldwell came to the Mercer claim in late January with his 2 sons. He walked through the chamber twice, studying the ceiling, the ventilation system, the brazier and its flue. He took notes in a small ledger and asked the same questions about ground temperature and thermal mass that he had asked in the dark the night of the storm. "I'm going to build a sod addition to our house," he said, "partly below grade, walls 3 feet thick, and I want a chamber like this underneath it as a winter shelter." He paused. "I would like to pay you for your advice." "I don't need payment," she said. "I will tell anyone who asks how to build it, all of it. The depth, the ceiling, the ventilation, the brazier dimensions, everything." Edwin Caldwell looked at her for a moment. "That's more generous than most adults manage to be," he said. She felt practical, not generous. If what she knew could keep people from dying in frame houses, then what she knew should be shared. Thomas Greer came to the Mercer claim one more time in February. He rode alone and tied his mule to the ruined fence post and called down to the well opening. She came up. They stood on the surface in the February cold. He had something in his saddlebag, a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside it, a hand mirror with a plain wooden frame. Her mother's. "I should have given this to you in August," he said. She had not seen her own face since August. She looked into the mirror and saw a person settled in, the way a face settles when it stops waiting for things to be easy. She put it in the pocket of her mother's coat. "I'm filing on this claim when I'm old enough to file," she said. He nodded. "It's a good piece of land." "Yes." He mounted his mule and rode back toward his own claim. She had survived his arithmetic and built something from what he had left her, which was nothing, which had turned out to be enough. She went back underground. Spring came. The prairie thawed and turned from white to the particular tender green of new grass that was the most beautiful color Margaret Calloway had ever seen. She broke 3 acres of ground that spring with a borrowed plow and Edwin Caldwell's second horse, and she planted wheat. She began laying the walls for the sod house she intended to build that summer, with its below-grade foundation and its connection to the earth chamber and its thick walls that would hold warmth the way the well home had held it. Ruth Caldwell brought her a seedling apple tree in April. "A long-term investment," Ruth said, "for someone who intends to stay." Maggie planted it 12 feet south of the well opening and watered it from the creek bucket every other day. It took root. That summer, 4 families in Cutter's Creek built sod additions with below-grade foundations, based on the principles Maggie had explained to Edwin Caldwell, who passed them along to his sons and neighbors. Jacob Forsyth, who had given her 4 candle stubs for a rabbit the previous October, built an earth-floor storage room beneath his general store and told anyone who would listen it was the best construction decision he had ever made. By the following winter, the settlement burned less wood. Children who had coughed through smoke-filled January nights breathed cleaner air. The particular February dread of woodpiles running out lifted for families whose walls finally held what their fires put into them. None of them used the term earth-sheltered construction. What they said was, build like the Callaway girl built, which meant dig down before you build up. Trust the earth to give back what it holds. Margaret Callaway proved up the Mercer claim in 1863, filing under the Homestead Act. She was 22. The wheat fields were in their 6th season. The sod house she had built in the summer of 1857 still stood solid and uncompromised. The apple tree was 6 feet tall and had fruited for the first time the previous autumn. The earth chamber below the well was still there, connected to the sod house by a low passage. A root cellar now, mostly. But she had never forgotten what it was before it was a root cellar. In the terrible winter of 1864, when a cold snap drove temperatures to -30, 3 families in Cutter's Creek spent the worst night sheltering in the chamber beneath the Callaway homestead. She had expanded it over the years. It held 12 people comfortably. They were all alive in the morning. The principle that Margaret Callaway had understood at 15 had not been invented in Kansas Territory in 1856. The Romans built into hillsides for the same reason. The Norse built longhouses partly below grade. The ancient peoples of the American Southwest understood cliff dwellings and the thermal mass of stone. Across centuries and continents, people who lived close to the land had trusted the earth to hold what the sky tried to take. What modern building science would call earth-sheltered construction, formalized after the energy crisis of the 1970s, was simply observation made permanent. The earth below the frost line sits at 52 degrees, and it will fight to stay there. And if you build inside that fight rather than against it, you will be warm. None of this was available to a 15-year-old girl in Kansas Territory in 1856. What she had was a dead man's description of a root cellar, a dry stone well, and a winter coming that would not wait. She used what she had. She dug down before she built up. She trusted the earth to hold what she gave it and give it back when she needed it. She built the hatch and the ladder and the brazier and the ventilation pipe and the sleeping platform and the clay-chinked ceiling. And then she survived, and then she helped 7 other people survive the night that killed 23 settlers across the territory. In the spring of 1858, Maggie was helping Ruth Caldwell's youngest daughter understand the principle of the frost line and why it mattered. The girl was 12 years old, and curious in the way 12-year-old girls are curious when they are allowed to be, asking the questions that come when no one has told you yet that some questions are not for you to ask. "How did you know it would work?" the girl said. "Before you tried it. How did you know?" Maggie thought about the August night in the bottom of the dry well, the cool air against her skin, her father's voice from 8 years before telling her about a root cellar in Missouri. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew the earth was warmer than the air. I knew that warmth had to go somewhere. I thought if I built where the warmth was, I might stay warm." The girl considered this. "That sounds simple." "It was simple," Maggie said. "That's why it worked." The people who laughed at Olaf's double-walled house and Anna's sod bricks and Jacob's masonry bed were not laughing at complexity. They were laughing at simplicity. They saw something that looked too basic, too obvious, too much like what a person with no resources and no training would try. They were right that it was basic. They were wrong that basic meant inferior. Sometimes the most basic thing is the most true thing. Sometimes the person with no resources discovers what the person with resources overlooked, because having resources makes you believe you do not need to pay attention to what the earth already provides. The frozen well on the abandoned Mercer claim did not look like a home to anyone who rode past it in August of 1856. It looked like a hole in the ground. It looked like something a person with nowhere else to go might use as a last resort, a temporary measure, an embarrassment. It was below the frost line. The earth around it was 52 degrees. A 15-year-old girl with a broken spade and a dead man's advice and no other choice looked at it and saw exactly what it was. She went to work. If this story made you think differently about what survival means and what ordinary people are capable of when ordinary options disappear, hit that like button and subscribe for more of these forgotten frontier histories. They matter. They are full of knowledge that modern building science has rediscovered and certified with equations what these people understood with their hands and their instincts and their absolute refusal to die. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. And tell me this, do you think you would have seen what Maggie saw in that dry stone well, or would you have kept walking? I read every single comment, and I want to know. The apple tree she planted in April of 1857 was still bearing fruit when her granddaughter played under it in 1912. The earth chamber was still there beneath the homestead, cool and dark and steady at 52 degrees, its willow pole ceiling long since replaced by hewn timber, its floor still packed earth, still holding the ground temperature that the Kansas earth had always held, and would go on holding long after everything built above it had returned to the prairie. The well that everyone said was worthless and frozen and no good to anyone turned out to be the warmest place in the territory on the coldest night in its history. The girl that everyone said would not make it turned out to be the one who saved them when the storm came. The earth knew what it was doing all along. It was just waiting for someone to listen.